IVM.
Suddenness. The sheer suddenness of the move, the unexpected nature of the move, the unpredictability of the move, the fact that there was no warning to the Chinese. They don't know what hit them. Now the Chinese will know. Now the Chinese will know that when we want to act, we shall act as we wish without warning. That we shall move in stealth and attack when necessary.
Over the last month, India has been witness to the most amount of bloodshed along the line of actual control since 1967. There's been a lot of back and forth between the Chinese and Indian governments over who changed status quo. Amidst all of this, the Indian government banned 59 Chinese apps and is slowing down the pace of progress of the other Chinese investments. The Indian border with China is about 457 kilometers and it's India's largest land border. For China, however, one land border is even longer. The Sino-Russian border is 4,209 kilometers long and has been contested since the 1920s. But by 2004, the territorial issues were solved by both sides. So this made me wonder, if instead of looking at our border struggles, we can look at how other borders with China fare. Welcome to States of Anarchy. My name is Hamsini Hariharan and I'm your host. Every week on the podcast, I speak to experts about global affairs and foreign policy, all in the hope of making a little more sense of the world today. The Sino-Russian border has changed over the years, but in the last decade, it's become more stable. Now with overland ports, infrastructure projects, all allowing for more movement across the border. So how do frontiers of Russia and China look like? What does cross-border exchange look like? How do locals perceive infrastructure projects in the region? When I first met my guest for today, I was really blown away not only by how much he knew about China and Russia, but by how cool his research was. Ankur Shah is a researcher based in London whose work focuses on China and Russia. He was previously a Yenching scholar at Peking University, where I also study. He's written for publications like The Economist, Foreign Policy, Nikkei Asian Review, The Diplomat, UNESCO, among others. Last year, Ankur, along with another Yenching scholar, Vivek Pisharodi, traveled across the Sino-Russian border. The project was supported by the Future Maps Foundation, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, and the Institute of International and Strategic Studies of Peking University. Previously, Ankur also drove 20,000 kilometers from Venice to Xi'an in a Silk Road expedition sponsored by National Geographic. Ankur and I speak about his road trips, what the border between Russia and China actually looks like, and its place in history and geopolitics. But before we get into the conversation, let's take a short break.
Hey everybody, welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. Their support makes this content possible. So, been a really exciting week on the network this week. We've had some really cool stuff. My old friend Vivek Lad was on Storytellers and Storysellers. Definitely do check that out. On Cyrus Said, we had Ashwin Sanghi on Thursday's episode, and Cyrus and myself did a cock and bull, just the two of us. That was fun as well on Monday. Do check that out. Masaba was on Advertising is Dead, which was another really, really strong episode from Varun. And on the sports front, both Edges and Sledges, Football Shitball had some really fun episodes. That's the Football Twaddle. Do check those out as well. And if you haven't been paying attention and you haven't been listening to Smile India in these times, I don't know why you aren't. It's the most uplifting show that you could listen to. It's a short, bite-sized piece of really positive things that happen in India. Do definitely check that out. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
Hi Ankur, welcome to States of Anarchy. I'm so glad that you're here after months of us planning this.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So last year, you road tripped across the Sino-Russian border, right? Tell me why you did that, how it was.
Yeah, it's been a long year since we went. So me and my fellow Yenchinger from the US, Vivek Pishardi, we spent close to 6 weeks traveling the entire China-Russia border, just on the Chinese side. The trip was fully sponsored, so just a quick shout out, as I must, to my sponsors, which were the Future Map Foundation, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, and also the International and Strategic Institute of Beida. Yeah, I don't know where you want to dig in on the trip, but it was 6 weeks long. We journeyed probably 7,000 kilometers. The border itself is just 4,000 kilometers long, but we did the whole border and then had to bring our car back. Yeah.
All right. So where did you start? Where did you finish? What was your aim behind the whole trip?
So we took a train from Beijing, where we were based, to Jilin. The border itself, there are actually three provinces along the border. So we're looking at China's northeast, and there are three provinces there: Jilin, Heilongjiang, and Inner Mongolia, Neimang. So we started in Jilin, which is where we picked up the car that we were renting. This is kind of like the easternmost part of that border. So the border actually starts, the easternmost part is in Hunchun, which is at the China-Russia-North Korea border. So we started in this area and kept moving in kind of westward arc. So in through Heilongjiang, all the way into Inner Mongolia at the China-Russia-Mongolia border. I think your listeners are probably going to need a map because I've become pretty familiar with all these places, but they're actually really remote, I think, especially to a lot of people who have mainly been to Beijing, Shanghai, and the eastern cities. And in terms of why this trip, I mean, there's so much I could really go into on that front. Just a little bit of background about me. So I studied Chinese and Russian at the University of Edinburgh. So I've been looking at these two countries and their cultures and their histories for close to a decade now. As with any big trip or big idea, I think you often start out with smaller ideas. So I'd taken a couple of trips up to this border in 2018, so 2 years ago now, and found myself pretty fascinated with what I saw. I went to a city called Heihua, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But anyway, I was super fascinated. I thought there's so much here that there's actually not too much by the way of literature on how this border looks today. I mean, it's one of the biggest borders in the world, and yet so little is actually known about how life looks there. So I guess, at some point, it just moved from an idea that was up on a sticky note on my wall, which was like, come on, do the whole border, not just one or two cities. And eventually we got the funding for it, and we went for it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, 6 weeks driving across the Sino-Russian border sounds really cool. What was the experience like? What did you see? How was the trip?
Yeah, I mean, again, just to maybe just give more background here, because there's just so much in this. So we had really two main objectives that we wanted to get out of an expedition like this. So the first was to look at the BRI, so that's the Belt and Road Initiative, and look at some of the key projects that are along the border. And we can talk more about the BRI later. I've got a lot of experience visiting different projects in different countries outside of China and looking at BRI projects. So one was to look at the BRI projects. The other was that 2019 was quite an important year in Sino-Russian relations. So it was the 70-year anniversary of Sino-Soviet diplomatic ties, which, while I was living in Beijing, was widely covered by state media. Putin and Xi, who are the respective leaders of both countries, kind of herald ties as being the best they have ever been. So like the background context is ties are as good as they have ever been. And yet 2019 was also the 50-year anniversary of the 1969 Sino-Soviet border war. So you have that anniversary, which is much lesser discussed, in fact, not at all discussed. And so those were the two things I was interested in, the BRI and the border war, and how that shapes, how ordinary lives look at the border, how these high-level ties can influence ordinary relations between peoples. So that's what we were sort of setting out to see. And you can plan as much as you want prior. And, we had coordinates for BRI projects, and we had an idea of where some of these border islands were. But, usually when you plan these sorts of trips, as I'm sure you know, like the reality can be quite different from what you think about.
Yeah, I'm sure. So before we dive into a lot of those things, let's talk a little bit about like Sino-Russian relations. And let's start off with the thing that you spoke about, which is the border war in 1969. And I think that a lot of Indians are very concerned about the Indian border with China for obvious reasons, particularly now more than ever. But I think they forget that, China shares borders with like 14 other countries. And until 1991, the biggest border was just with the Soviet Union. So let's go back a little bit in time to see what sort of the Sino-Russian border was and how it evolved. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm going to just drop that I'm not a historian, but let me tell you what I know through my research I've learned. So China basically contends that several of the border islands, so this border is primarily separated by rivers. So the Amur River, which is the name for the Chinese is the Heilongjiang, which I mentioned the province. And in this river, there are several islands that have basically been under contest between China and the Soviet Union and then Tsarist Russia. And China basically states that due to several unfair historic treaties signed between Qing dynasty, so that's, the Qing dynasty and Tsarist Russia between the 17th and 19th centuries, Soviet Russia and Russia acquired these islands, these border islands. Probably the most high profile of the islands is Jinbao Island, which in Russian is known as Damansky Ostrov. And in the 1960s, and I don't know the Indian context quite as well, but I think this was a similar time where, China had fraught relations with its neighbors at its borders. And in the case of China and Russia, this tension came because Nikita Khrushchev, who was then the leader, the USSR, denounced Stalinism, and he denounced the USSR's advocacy for peaceful coexistence with the West. So these two things were pretty much intolerable to Mao Zedong. And Mao didn't want to subordinate the PRC to the Soviet Union, and he also believed that the PRC should be the world leader of communism. So that's the background. And in 1969, which I mentioned this anniversary in March, Chinese troops ambushed Soviet border guards who were currently patrolling that island, Jinbao Island. And I think 30 or 31 people died on the Soviet side. And no one really knows what the reasons were for this attack. I mean, I suggested some there. Other people postulate that Mao wanted to distract from China's Cultural Revolution, which was going on at the time, and unite the population around a kind of common enemy. And so, you had that surprise attack. 2 weeks after the surprise attack, Soviets retaliated and actually inflicted 800 deaths on the Chinese side. So it's a pretty bloody war, actually. Tensions were really escalating in the late 60s, and I did an interview with a couple of scholars on this. I remember one professor at Oxford called Stephen Smith said that it may have been the time that the world came closest to a nuclear conflict, the Cuban Missile Crisis notwithstanding. So that to me is one of the things that I find fascinating is, I mean, that's not something I've really studied too much when I was at school and looking at the Cold War, but this small conflict over this tiny island actually really shaped the Cold War, because after the conflict, on Jinbao Island, actually, it really created conditions for the Sino-American Entente. So China and the US actually came closer together. The thing I find interesting, and you're talking about the Indian disputes with China, which are, so they're really, I think at the forefront of a lot of people's minds right now. But the China-Russia disputes weren't actually resolved until 2004. So that's like 40 years, really, of them being unresolved. But they were resolved in the end, and that there you see there is a model for these disputes being resolved. And I think the fact that they were resolved the fact that they were resolved is the main context for me for China-Russia relations today. It's the fact that they've been able to get over this major issue in their ties.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd sort of agree with you there. If the Chinese and the Russians can resolve their border issue, it means that it's not impossible to conceive of a border between India and China that is someday not under conflicting circumstances. But, what I also wonder is, was the border between the Soviet Union and China absolute? Was it a porous border? How did that work? And how is it now?
Yeah, so I think these sorts of things tend to follow the high level ties. So, during the 60s, 70s, and probably 80s, it was still pretty tense. Maybe early 80s, its ties start to get better. And certainly by the time the 90s came along, the border started opening up to trade more and more. And you can see that, therefore, that improvement at the high level of political ties definitely contributed to economic ties improving. And a big thing you hear about when you're at the border, and you can still see some of it today, is suitcase traders. So you would have sort of rural Russians and equivalent Chinese just coming across the border with suitcases of goods and just selling to one another. And it's actually really interesting, some of the stuff they sell. Like, I really make an effort to try and buy loads of random local goods when I'm there. But yeah, I
That's
think
actually really cool. Like, I mean, I don't know if you know this, but what would like people from like the Russian side sell in China, and like, and on the other side, what would like the Chinese sell in Russia? I would be really interested to know that.
yeah, no, it is interesting, isn't it? I think, yeah, it's I mean, on the Russian, so first, again, context for my research has always been on the Chinese side of the border. So I've interacted with a lot of Russians who come over from Russia to China. One example would be in Manzhouli, which is at the China-Russia-Mongolia border, and there is like a customs port where you get these suitcase traders coming over, flogging their goods. Some of the stuff they sell, I mean, some of the stuff I've bought is Russian honey, for example. So there's a lot of like natural goods on the Russian side. So that border is not far from Lake Baikal. So it's like a very natural, fertile region. So honey is a classic. I guess also in terms of China and sort of the Chinese people that live there, there would be a lot of interest in the Russian side and sort of European goods. So you end up getting a lot of goods that are supposedly European, like coffee and even tea, actually. Like Russian tea, a lot of people don't realize tea is a major part of Russian culture. And I'm not saying that Chinese people prefer Russian tea to their own. They probably don't. But
Yeah, no, I completely get it. I just like, if you say that Russian tea and Russian honey is like stuff that you would get on the border, that's not the first thing that comes to my mind, right? Like, I'm imagining like much more, exotic in quotes goods that are being traded. But this is super cool. What else?
yeah, no, seriously, so much else. I could go on and on about this. So like, there's a lot of like Russian style hats and coats that you probably like can imagine when you think about Russia and like bitter winters and snow. And so the fur hats and fur coats are often sold by the Russians. It's interesting to think about the Russians that come across the border. So again, when you think about China's trajectory and Russia's trajectory, China obviously is I mean, made in China, right? So a lot of people come to China looking for cheap goods, and you get these Russians who cross the border. And again, they would bring an empty suitcase. And I'm not talking about traders necessarily now, just regular Russians, our age, who literally will come across the border for a weekend, bring a suitcase and just fill it up with things like clothes, bags, pretty cheap goods, if I'm being honest, like the kind of stuff I would see in my context in the UK in like the 1990s, but still seems to be maybe popular over there. Yeah.
And I remember you saying that you visited other cities also along the border, right? So what would those cities be like? Would they be different from Manjali, and how would they sort of be different?
Yeah, I mean, completely different, to be honest, in a lot of ways. I think this is really the challenge for me in telling this story is just you're talking about 4,000 kilometers of borderlands and then several major cities, lots of townships, incredibly diverse landscapes from like rolling hills on the Mongolian side. So it's like quite like Central Asia to me. So it's like endless greenery. To like in Heilongjiang, you get this like bread baskets. It's where a lot of China's wheat is produced. Yeah, a couple of the major cities, I guess, that I was very fond of that I know I'd like to return to once travel becomes possible. So Heihua is one. That was my first encounter with the border. So I think I went when I went in 2018 to look at one of the BRI projects there. So I've got a soft spot for that city. And yeah, it's a beautiful city. Like it really is. Like it's on the River Amur, on the Heilongjiang River. It's relatively modern by I would say most global standards. I mean, I think that's the other funny thing. Like you think about how remote these places are. And I always have these conversations when I'm discussing it with Indian family members, because like the infrastructure in these tiny towns or cities is tremendous. Like it's just modern roads, not so many potholes. You can drive from A to B really over hundreds or thousands of kilometers with absolutely no difficulty. And that's what we did. And again, I mentioned Heihua. Then another really interesting city was Hunchuin at the China-Russia-North Korea border, which again, like in many ways is quite a normal Chinese city in the sense that, it's modern, there's transport links, infrastructure is good. ethnically very diverse. So you get a lot of the North Korean ethnic minority people and Korean minority people there. And that, of course, influences things like food in each of the cities being different depending on the ethnic makeup of that place. Yeah, huge border, very diverse, basically.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because I don't know if I told you this, but last year I traveled to Inner Mongolia and we passed through Jilin, we passed through these smaller cities, and we eventually landed up in Arshan. And I didn't really know what I was thinking of in my head because, like most other Indians, I think I imagine it to be a little barren. I imagine it to be,
Yeah.
not many things there and so on. And I guess like the diversity of what I was seeing every single day really stunned me. And
Hmm.
when we say small cities, they're small in Chinese context, right? But like
Yeah.
a city of 3 million, might not be small in the Indian context, but they have like good infrastructure and like, the roads are clean and they have things that are provided for. And I think the way that looks is something that's surprising for me as someone who hasn't traveled through other border areas before.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. Another thing I'm always surprised about. So on this trip, like we had 4G basically throughout the entire trip, which is like just shocking to me. Like we had complete and perfect internet connection as like anywhere, almost everywhere. Interestingly, I should say, the only place that we found it completely dropped was when we got to Jinbao Island, so around the border island. But anyway, I'm
That's
done.
that's
Yeah.
understandable.
Yeah, I guess it's a security concern, perhaps. I'm not sure, but yeah, just the modernity of it is interesting because I think a lot of people, when I tell this story, I think there's a lot of exoticizing and a lot of like romanticizing about like exploring through unknown territories. But the reality is like things are very well connected, for better or worse. So
So I was wondering, when you're talking about like these people coming over on either side, is it just as simple as if you have like a Russian passport or if you have like a Chinese identity card, you can just show that and walk through the borders? Is it just like a free port of entry, or are there restrictions about that?
yeah, so the Russian Far East. So if you're on the Chinese side and you're a Chinese tourist and you're trying to go over to the Russian side, they have a visa-free regime that Russia introduced within the last 5 or 7 years, maybe. So it basically enables tourists to go. Most of the Chinese tourists tend to go, and maybe this is more of a cultural dimension, but they tend to travel in groups.
Mhm.
You get these big groups of Chinese tourists going the other way. Rather, as for Russians coming into China, I think it varies tremendously. So, like when we're talking about suitcase traders, increasingly, and this is another example of how high level politics sort of impacts this border, but the Eurasian Economic Union, which is effectively an economic bloc led by Russia, comprising several former Soviet Union states, it has introduced certain restrictions on its members, and that has actually trickled down in this way. So I know that a lot of the regulations have started to impact the way in which some of these traders can work. So I don't think that impacts their ability to cross the border per se. I think they can actually cross with the same amount of ease the Chinese can. That would mean not necessarily entering a city, but actually just entering the free trade zone and the customs port. So most of these major cities that I've just talked to you about have customs ports. Koan is the Chinese word, on the land border. So they can cross the land border, enter the customs port, sell their goods, and return. But for tourists who are just coming over for regular, tourism and retail and yeah, for fun, for them it's slightly different. They would probably need the visa.
Yeah, and we spoke a little bit about like the ethnic makeup of the border varying depending on where you are. How did it sort of affect the language that was being spoken there? With your Beijing Putonghua, were you able to navigate it, or did you see a lot of influence of Russian, considering that you also speak Russian?
It's a really interesting question. Yeah, so I've been spoilt by traveling China's northeast because everyone speaks the most crisp Mandarin that is possible. So again, for listeners who aren't as familiar, China has its sort of Mandarin Putonghua that you just mentioned, which is the standardized version. But you travel to other parts of China, and for instance, my first experiences in China were in Sichuan, in China's southwest, in Chengdu, and really, really beautiful part of China. And I remember getting off the plane when I first arrived, and I'd studied Chinese for 2 years by this point, and I honestly could not understand a single word that was being spoken to me. Like I was like, I am not going to survive in this country. But by contrast, the Northeast is incredible. I mean, it's really crisp Mandarin that is spoken, very easy to understand. It's actually kind of funny. So, like China's Northeast in Chinese is called Dongbei, and a lot of in China, a lot of people make fun of the Dongbei accent, like it's just like a national joke to mock them. But personally, I was like very grateful for how standardized it was. And with regard to your question about the Russian that is spoken, again, really interesting. I'm always really disappointed, but I always find that basically very few people speak Russian in these parts. I remember, I mean, the majority of people that speak a little bit tend to be traders who interact with Russian tourists, but even they barely know sort of, basic phrases like how much does this cost, and this is the price, make it cheaper, make it more expensive, blah, blah, blah.
Bargaining lingo.
Bargaining trade, yeah, very standard. But there's like there wasn't a great sort of sense that many people were, especially amongst the youngest generations. I would argue, especially on the Chinese side and on the Russian side, are both much more Western leaning and in favor of learning English, which I think makes sense. There's a lot of high level talk that this is changing, and that a lot of Chinese students are going to Russia and Russian students coming to China, but I think they're a fraction of the number that study English. Similarly, if you look at the elite, Chinese elite and Russian elite, I think both of them prefer to send their children to Western countries to learn English. So I think on the ground, you could really see that there weren't many all the young people we met were speaking with us in good English, not in Russian.
Yeah, that is very interesting. And it also sort of drives back to the other point that we were speaking about, which is sort of like the ethnic minorities that are along this route. And I'm wondering just how that played out because, for listeners who don't know a lot about China's ethnic makeup, but China has, 54 ethnic minorities? Or,
Yeah, 55,
yeah.
I guess, if you include Han, but yeah.
Yeah, 55 if you include Han. So, did you see a huge difference with ethnic minorities in the area?
Yeah, again, this has been probably, like I said at the beginning, I had these stated objectives that I wanted to realize, but this was one of the things that I was quite surprised about. So I've done a lot of traveling in China's southwest, so Sichuan I mentioned, and also Yunnan, which is on the border with a couple of Southeast Asian countries. And I think to a lot of people who have traveled within China, these are the most ethnically diverse parts of China, the southwest, and that is true. But I was really surprised by how diverse the Northeast was. One of the minority people, like I said, that we encountered with were the North Korean minority and the Korean minority. And I mean, in terms of the encounters with them, the food that they make was delicious. Like I've never been to Korea, but I was eating kimchi like every single day, and which I guess, yeah, that was really fun. But yeah, but at the same time, let me just say a couple of other ethnic minorities, and I'll talk about the bigger picture. So that was one. Another interesting one that I hadn't heard of before is called the Hezhe minority, and I don't know if you've heard of them, but they are a cross-border people. I think the majority of their population are on the Russian side, and really interesting. Like a lot of their clothing is made up of fish skin, so that historically fisher people, and so they do a lot of handiwork and craft with fish skin. And Vivek and I stumbled upon this township that was dedicated to those people. So again, I don't know how much you know about this, but a lot of the small towns along this border, and I'm sure along other borders in China, are named after the people. I don't know if this is meant to be some sort of tribute from Beijing and from the party to those people, but it's sort of touristifying, if that is a word, or exoticizing is what we encountered in reality, the people who live there. So we were hoping to encounter more people when we learned that this Hezhe small township existed, and we really struggled actually to find locals who are authentically Hezhe. We ended up finding a small restaurant run by a Hezhe family, and it was the most interesting encounter because on one hand they look slightly different to your average Han person, and they had the traditional clothing. They weren't wearing it, but it was sort of there, and you could tell it was there for them to take out when tourists come, because that's how they were making their living. They were a restaurant, and sort of promoting their identity was part of their sale or pitch, if you like. But But we ended up sitting down for them for lunch, and I have to apologize to Vivek here because he was driving that day, so I got to enjoy quite a few drinks with them and over lunch. And I got, yeah, it was a really interesting lunch, but I definitely did notice that the ways in which they were toasting to one another, for example, was very similar to the ways that I've encountered in Han culture. The ways that they were talking to each other was in Mandarin, even though they could very easily have slipped into their own language. And again, you could see the difference between the generations. So the youngest generation were extremely assimilated into sort of mainland Han Chinese culture. And so you could see that from generation to generation, this ethnic identity that they maybe was perhaps more strong in previous generations was disappearing. And that was my experience, or our experience, of encounters with other ethnic minorities. So probably the most interesting one was with the Russian ethnic minority people. So one of the 55 ethnic minorities in China is the Russian minority, and there's probably, I mean, I don't have an accurate number of how many there are. Different state figures suggest that there's around 10,000 people of this minority. I've read something closer to 2,000, so it's difficult to say. But we had some really fascinating encounters with people from that minority. And again, I would say the vast majority of those could not speak a word of Russian. They were not that interested in Russia or that legacy in terms of their identity in so Chinese people have what's called a 身份证, like a identity card, and usually states what minority they belong to. And a lot of the people we met were very keen, of the Russian minority, were very clear that their children would have Han status if they had married, a Russian minority had married a Han person, then that's the status they would give it. So I find that fascinating, like especially when we think about, I mean, you mentioned the China-India border, and we think about, I mean, in the northwest, so Xinjiang, another very ethnically diverse part of China, and you think about how ethnic identity and the huge tensions that we see in those areas, and when I compare that to what I see in the northeast, people are really assimilated here. I mean, it might just be that we were not able to find that true identity and that true diversity, and maybe that's why I need to go back to the border. But to me, it was a really surprising discovery how well assimilated, and that's testament to the policy that the CCP has employed in that part of China. It's really managed to bring those people into this, what China calls the big family of minorities.
All of that is really, really fascinating. And I remember reading this article that you wrote a while back for The Economist, I think, where you were talking about how the Orthodox Church worked in some of the border areas. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you for entertaining all of my interest in the ethnic minority culture. It's just so interesting. And maybe I should just clarify, I guess for me, very quickly, so I'm born in the UK, but my family are from India. And so I think for me, I've grown up as an ethnic minority in the UK. So meeting people in China, where I think people think about China, they think about Han. They don't really realize how diverse the country is and how complex identity is. And it's especially complex when religion gets involved. So one of the unexpected discoveries that we sort of found upon on our travels was a Russian Orthodox church in China. So this is also in this western part of the border in Inner Mongolia. And yeah, I mean, I don't know where to start on that encounter. We didn't really see it coming. We ended up finding this church, and so for those people who don't know, China has certain religions which are officially recognized, and Russian Orthodoxy is not one of them. So to find one of these churches was very interesting. And what we learned was that the Russian Orthodox Church does not actually operate it's not illegal, nor is it legal. It sort of operates in this gray zone. And I personally, in my research, has found that a lot of that is to do with Putin and Xi's personal ties. So the Russian Orthodox Church has actually gained some momentum under Putin and Xi. And we managed to stumble upon the father of that church who was there. And he also happens to be a Russian ethnic minority, a person of Russian ethnic descent. And interestingly, he spoke fluent Russian. So that was the first time I'd met someone of this ethnicity who was completely, really connected with that culture. And I guess that's where religion plays such a strong tie in legacy. But yeah, that was a really interesting encounter. And he was just talking about how challenging it is to maintain the faith. They have very dwindling community. And yeah, no, very, very interesting encounter.
Yeah, I'm sure. And it's also very interesting because it tells you a lot about the religious makeup in China, right? Because I think when I'm there and people are like, oh, you're Indian, and then they immediately want to know a lot about Hinduism. And it's like for them, in that way, I'm sort of exotic and I'm okay with that. But it's very interesting for me to see that the Russian Orthodoxy sort of operates in this you're not banned, so you stay like slightly under the radar
Yeah.
way. It is really fascinating.
Yeah, actually, and we should probably move on to something else, but really interesting on the exoticization thing. I mean, that is something we saw so much. So across the border, a lot of my assumption would be that in a borderland region, one of the bigger, something that policy could try to achieve is to try and assimilate all of those diverse peoples under one common narrative. But what I ended up finding was that a lot of the museums, the tourist sites were directed not at the ethnic minorities, but actually at Han people who would come to those places. So they were exoticizing the minorities kind of for Han consumption. So throughout the border, we would just be driving on a road and you would just see enormous totem poles, which like nativist Indian totem poles, which were clearly constructed in like the last couple of years, and they had no meaning beyond themselves. And yet clearly it was kind of like pushed at Han travelers who were coming to these parts of China to see how diverse their country is. I don't really think they had any bigger meaning on that. But that exoticization of the ethnic minority culture is super interesting to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. When I was in Yunnan, I saw a lot of this as well. I actually met a lady from Sichuan, and she was showing me and my friend Alithia photos of her dressed up in all sort of like the ethnic costumes from different regions. And then she was telling us about like who her favorite ethnic minorities were. And it was just like a very revealing conversation to me because, as an Indian and as someone from like a very diverse background, I don't personally have a favorite ethnic minority, and now
Maybe you should. Maybe you need to pick one.
maybe that's the outcome of this podcast. Maybe I need to pick one. But it is that sort of fetishization, that sort of exoticization of ethnic minorities does definitely exist. The other thing that I'm wondering is more related to the second part that you were talking about, that you wanted to go and see Belt and Road projects. And this is very interesting for me because this area, like sort of the border, most of it is the Rust Belt of China in a sense, right? These are sort of the areas that really started with manufacturing back when PRC was formed in 1949. But over the last couple of years, they've really been outstripped by the Chinese coastal areas. So how was it to sort of see the economy functioning along the border?
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that this part of China is much poorer than the eastern coast. I mean, yeah, you can't compare it. Big cities are still unbelievably impressive, and I don't want to. It's always tricky to get the balance right because I think when you're traveling, there's a tendency to go from A to B. And so if you're doing this by train, you take a high-speed rail. So one of the BRI projects is from Jilin in the northeast. It's both the province and then the capital city of that province is also called Jilin, to Hunchun, which I mentioned on the China-Russia-North Korea border. And there is a high-speed train that's been branded under the BRI label. And I think if you took the train from A to B, you would be just unbelievably impressed. I mean, you're going from like brand new train station to brand new train station on a high speed rail. It's extremely well constructed, smooth. But then I guess because we had this unique opportunity to drive from A to B, you see a lot of the smaller townships in between, and you do get a sense of the fact that poverty is still a major issue, especially in this part of China. And I guess more on an anecdotal level, and I don't know how, this is not quantitative, but it's just usually a fun way when I travel of gauging things, but you could just see the price dropping. So the price of the average beer, the price of our meal, like that was clearly happening. And yeah, there was just a very clear sense of us being in a poorer, cheaper part of China. But I mean, I absolutely loved it, don't get me wrong. And
that is interesting. So when we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, I think a lot of people who've heard about it on sort of like the international scale, know about like the ports in Gwadar or like the oil pipelines that are being constructed, but they don't sort of imagine BRI to be part of like an internal project or multiple projects, in fact, right? So, what were the ones that you'd mapped out, or how many were you able to see?
Yeah. I mean, just for context, I guess for people who still have somehow managed to have been living under a rock and don't know what the BRI is. So the Belt and Road Initiative is Xi Jinping's kind of premier foreign policy. In very simple terms, it's received a lot of criticism for various economic reasons. So a lot of people claiming that it is a way to engage in debt trap diplomacy and gain influence. So you mentioned, I mean, ports. Another famous port example is in Hambantota in Sri Lanka, where famously China acquired a major stake in it. And again, security concerns. You mentioned Gwadar, also the port in Djibouti. So again, a lot of pushback from the international community. And I guess some people probably still see it as one initiative. But yeah, for me, I've been researching this since 2017 now and really intensely following it. In 2017, I spent 4 months driving from Venice to Beijing, and we passed through 16 countries. We must have gone to a dozen or so projects that have been branded under the BRI. And that, I think, is a key way to see it. So these projects may have existed before the BRI came into existence. So the BRI is from around 2013 when Xi Jinping first announced it. But a lot of the projects that are advertised or marketed as BRI projects actually predate the initiative. So it's very complex. I think the most fundamental starting point when you want to look at the BRI is to ask yourself, is this a BRI project? There is no concrete list of BRI projects that exists that you can just turn to. And a lot of the reason for that is that local companies and state-owned enterprises get huge economic benefits if they manage to have their project loosely affiliated with this initiative. So there's a great incentive to become somehow involved in the initiative. And I think that creates more problems than it does solutions, really. In terms of the projects along this border that are affiliated under the BRI, the most high profile, I'd say, are two projects. They're both bridges. One is the Heihe Blagoveschensk Bridge. So that's the name of both cities, one on the Chinese and one on the Russian side. And that's a highway bridge. I visited that one in 2018 and again last year. And then the other, I would say, most high-profile project is the Tongjiang Nizhny Leninskaya Bridge. So that's that one's a railway bridge, so it's more for freight transportation. And as I say, I've been following this Sino-Russian relations for close to a decade, and I've been following these bridges before the BRI even existed. And these bridges, they've been trying to construct them since the 90s. I mean, that was when the the Memorandums of Understanding were first signed in relation to them. And interestingly, so whether or not you want to debate whether these should or should not be BRI projects, given how old they actually are, I think this is a good way to see how the BRI can function to China's benefit and to partner countries' benefit, because by being labeled under the BRI, I think it gained some momentum, it gained impetus, it gained maybe more financial stimulus, gained more attention, gained more accountability. And so these projects are finally, after decades of stagnation, coming to fruition. They're still not completed, and that is, I mean, let's talk about that in a second. But yeah, I guess those are the two main projects that we saw. We can talk about others in a minute.
Sure. All of that is very fascinating, and we'll get back to your trip from Venice to Beijing in a bit. But what I first want to know is, what was sort of the difference that you saw between visiting Heihe in 2018 and then visiting it again last year?
Interesting question. I guess maybe just keeping this on BRI, the progress that was made on the bridge was pretty tangible. When I went there last time, there was a lot remaining to be completed on the Chinese and the Russian side. So a major issue with infrastructure projects that I think people don't realize. So when we talk about a project being finished, people often talk about the hard infrastructure has been completed. So in Heihe and Blagoveschensk, that was the case. The hard infrastructure, the bridge, was completed. But in order for a project to become operational, you also rely on a lot of the soft infrastructure. in a cross-border project, that's even more complicated because you need things like customs, borders, and other such soft infrastructure issues. So again, between 2018 and 2019, a lot of that soft infrastructure on the Chinese side was not there. You could just see the bridge, but there was nothing to actually connect people once they came onto the other side. And that was different in 2019 when I went back last year. So a lot of the soft infrastructure on the Chinese side was really up and ready to go. In terms of Heihua as a city in that year, I mean, very little change, as you would expect, not too much.
And how did people look at the BRI projects? Was there cynicism? Was there optimism? Was there a range of emotions in between, which is what I'm guessing you're going to say?
Yeah, I mean, yes, the last one. As with all things, we were trying to collect a diverse set of so we did a lot of semi-structured interviews with stakeholders, so including local elite, local politicians in some of these cities, down to the construction workers who are actually working on the projects. Also, we interviewed stakeholders like traders who actually would end up using the infrastructure. And yeah, we got a huge amount of a massive variety of opinions. So there was, I mean, maybe from the high level, from the entire trip, one of the interesting things that we noticed was that in China, it's very common along roadsides to have these huge red banners with political slogans. And you'd often see, I remember on my previous travels in that Silk Road trip in 2017, when we entered China, there was a lot of advertisements for the BRI. And what I noticed on this trip was that we encountered one advertisement, one of these posters in this entire trip of 6 weeks and 7,000 kilometers. And that is really interesting because actually I think what I realized was that the establishment is actually playing down the BRI in the domestic narrative. So compared to how the initiative was pushed in China domestically as this sort of opportunity to say, we've arrived to the global stage, China is here, the BRI is really our big moment on the world stage, or one of our major moments on the world stage. You could see the fact that they weren't talking about this. We had these interviews, so the fact that there weren't posters about this in our interviews with local elite, which were explicitly arranged to discuss their viewpoints on the BRI, they completely navigated around talking about it. They spoke about the projects, but they barely mentioned the term. And I think that is testament to the fact that on the ground, really grassroots, when I'm talking about, local stakeholders, there has been a lot of cynicism and skepticism as to these projects. Why are there such huge amounts of investment in these projects and not other projects that maybe are more domestically orientated? Was the type of question we would be asked. What's interesting about border economies is that you get a lot of entrepreneurial people who try and facilitate trade, whereas the purpose of the BRI is actually to make trade more sort of smooth and seamless. So you had a lot of these business people that had set up businesses because of the inefficiencies in cross-border trade, who maybe suddenly were like, well, as these projects become, there are less barriers and less customs issues. And I'm talking, for example, about a project in Manzhouli. There's a customs port there. And we interviewed a number of timber traders, for example, that would import timber from Russia into China. And I remember a lot of them saying, our business is now going to struggle because of this, because actually it's a lot easier to do that trade and our role is not as important anymore. So there was that local questioning. And I think there was also a sense of just understanding. Like, I don't want to patronize people who live there. So people understood that these projects are important for China's global image, for China's relationship with Russia, for political means. And those political means don't always benefit local stakeholders. And so I think they were aware of it.
That's very fascinating because when you sort of think about why projects don't take off easily, and you think about how, middlemen are always an issue. And these are sort of the middlemen, right? These are people who are effectively making use of market failures in these areas before, and now they'll have to figure out with what they do for their livelihoods if this project does come back up.
Yeah.
And I'm also, interested So you road tripped between Venice and Beijing, and you saw a lot of BRI projects on the way there as well, right? How were those projects different from the projects that you saw on this road trip?
The big question I always have when I think about the BRI, which I just do far too often for my own mental health, but like the big question is, what is a BRI project? And I think you can drive yourself like it's a real key question. There are different indicators for what constitutes a BRI project. And I think on that trip, we got, so like I said, 16 countries, a real variety of different stages of projects. So you had projects that were, up and running, ready to go. I remember we visited, for example, a train station in Azerbaijan that would be connecting the country better to Turkey. And you could see the impacts of the project, and it was ready to go. And you compare that to other projects that we saw. I'm thinking of one in Georgia where we had the coordinates for this project. And this is a classic issue that you encounter when you're researching the BRI, is that the coordinates and the data that is centralized, or you might be able to find through open source researching, doesn't actually match what you find on the ground. And so we thought we had all of the right coordinates for some projects. And in Georgia, I remember we just turned up at some old Soviet railway station that was like literally a kind of like a museum or some kind of artifact. And it was not a high-speed railway train station. So that the variety we had in that trip was enormous in terms of the types of projects, the level of completion, the impact that it may or may not have been making. And that's probably worth a whole conversation in itself. But in comparison to this trip, and that partly reflects my own ability to do this research, because I just have a much better understanding of how to conduct it. And I think looking within China's own borders, it's a little bit easier, actually. There's more information on the domestic side in terms of these projects and how to find them and where they're at. So I suppose this trip was slightly easier in that sense, insofar as I had quite a clear list of the projects we wanted to visit, where they were, who you could interview around those projects. And that obviously shaped how I perceived them.
As we're sort of winding down to this podcast, I'm just wondering, what are the big takeaways from the Sino-Russian border when you think about it retrospectively?
Oh, big question. I guess it's interesting because you go into something like this with a lot of expectations, and obviously some of those are confirmed, and then there are surprises in other senses. One of the big takeaways is just how asymmetric this border looks. So a lot of the main cities that I mentioned, especially where the BRI projects are, there are customs ports. And a lot of these custom ports, there are what are called national gates. So in Chinese, guomen. And at these gates are often tourist sites. So you can come into one of these massive gates and climb up it and view the border. And you can view both sides of the border. So a good example of that is in Suifenhua, which is on the eastern side of the border. And you look into the Russian side, and with no disrespect, it's really like looking into like 30 years ago. Like it's very barren. It's like the road is single track, like a dirt road. And then you look back onto the Chinese side, and it's this 8-lane, 10-lane highway. And that asymmetry is something that I noticed at almost every point along the border. And it's honestly built into the tourist infrastructure. This is my own takeaway. Like personally, I feel as though there's a real effort that has been made by the Chinese side to create these enormous national gates. So you see on the other side into Russia, and there's like a tiny, I mean, it's not wooden, but like, let's just say a really pathetic gate on the other side. And it's this massive, like this contrast that exists, and it's very purposeful to me on the Chinese side. There's a clear intention that tells its citizens the story of its story, its national project, its economic growth, in contrast to perhaps, so China used to think of the Soviet Union as its older brother. That's what they call it, like 大哥. And you can see how much of that has changed along this border. So you can see that China does not look at Russia in any way as its older brother anymore. And now it's Russia that has to look up to China. And I think that's one of the major takeaways, is that China-Russia relations, definitely on the high level, definitely in the economic sector, where, Guangdong is one Chinese province is the size of the Russian economy. And across this entire border, that asymmetry exists. And I think that's one of the dynamics I'll be paying attention to in my future research as to how that plays out, because a lot of what we know about Russia is that Russia does not want to be treated as a junior partner. That was one of the major issues with Russia's relations with the West since the end of the Cold War, that Russia felt as though it was being patronized and subjugated. And that's one of the strengths of Chinese diplomacy. But how treating Russia with, at least in rhetoric, with equality. So how that dynamic will play out will be very interesting. But I'm very, very keen to go to the Russian side of the border and do the equivalent of what I did on this trip. So follow the whole border and just understand what the dynamic is and how they perceive their Chinese neighbors. Because again, I think that mental change will be very interesting, because a lot of the people, this is all living, live history. So for a lot of these Chinese people, they would have looked up to Russians as their older brother, and seen Russia as this technological elite, like much further ahead. And that's changed massively. But the people are there, have always been there, and are still there now. So I would love to go to the Russian side and see what that asymmetry looks like from the other side, and look at China from the Russian Far East.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I really hope that you're able to do that. This is my last question for you, Ankur. What are books or resources that you would recommend for people who want to know more about like Sino-Russian Border or BRI or anything that you can think of?
They should follow me on Twitter, I think, which I hope you can plug. But no, one of my favorite books is actually came out, I think, last year, which is by Ed Pulford. It's called Mirrorlands. So it's kind of anthropological. It's more accessible. It deals with history, politics, but he is someone who's also, he's a Cambridge-trained linguist who speaks Chinese and Russian, and he spent a tremendous amount of time in these borderlands doing research. So I would highly recommend that in terms of trying to get to grips with the border. That there isn't a huge amount of literature on that topic, on how things look on the ground today. So I think that's probably your best chance at that. And maybe for those who are maybe more interested in learning about the BRI, there's a lot of books about the BRI, a lot of which I would not recommend reading. I think probably if people are very serious just trying to learn about, for instance, projects in their region or projects in a specific place, I would highly recommend checking out CSIS. That's the Center for Strategic and International Studies. They have a great project called Reconnecting Asia, which I think we spoke about previously. Mm-hmm. So I'd recommend checking out that website. They have a really cool map, and it's very interactive. You can click on a region and then a project and learn about it. So those would be my two recommendations.
Awesome. Until you write your book and we're able to read it, I think these work. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ankur. Thank you for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me, Hamsini.
That's it for this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us. I've attached links to some of Ankur's recommendations in the episode description, so do check those out. If you have any comments or criticisms, then feel free to reach out to me at HamsiniH on Twitter or at States of Anarchy on Instagram. If you liked this episode, then I would love it if you left us a rating on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast app that you use. If you want to explore more of the world of foreign policy and strategic studies, let me suggest some of the policy courses at the Takshashila Institution. They do some really cool research and offer policy courses of various lengths. So do go check them out at www.takshashila.org.in. I hope you're safe and healthy during this difficult time and that you'll tune into the next episode. You can listen to States of Anarchy not only on the IVM podcast app, but also on Spotify, iTunes, Savan, Google Podcasts, or whatever you're using right now to listen to this. Happy listening.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कुटस्थाने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहां प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।
Family businesses get a bad rap. At one time, they were looked down on for getting rich, for being too ambitious. Today, they're still looked down on, but for not being ambitious enough. Not agile enough, not modern enough, too traditional in their mindset. The biggest brands and business houses in the country started out as humble family businesses. It's the way India has done business. Join Sonu Bhasin in conversation with stalwarts of Indian family businesses on the Inheritors podcast series by Bloomberg Quint. Discuss the highs and lows, the needs and pressure points of building a business legacy that spans generations.